All right. So we are on the Mount of Olives. We are looking at the most halakha piece of real estate in the entire world. Right? We are, in front of us lies the dome, the Temple Mount, right where the Jewish temple stood. Today, this is where the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock Islamic buildings are located. According to Jewish tradition, right underneath the Dome of the Rock, the reason why it's called the Rock, right, is there is a mountain. Anyone know the name of that mountain? Exactly, Moriah, right? According to Jewish tradition, when God created the world, right, in Genesis, he begins with Moriah and then spreads out. Also, Abraham, when he was told by God for his final test to sacrifice his only son, whom he loves, Isaac, right? He leaves Beersheba, goes on a 3-day journey, and arrives at Mount Moriah, and there he will bind Isaac, right? And by the way, with a nice, interesting thing about that story, right? With the binding of Isaac, a lot of people tend to think of Isaac, right, as this helpless young lad who's just sort of along for the ride, and there's nothing he could do about it. That's really not the case, because he is a 27-year-old man. He can overpower his over 100-year-old father. If he didn't want to be a sacrifice, he could have gotten out of it. He was a willing participant in this sacrifice, right? But of course, he's not sacrificed, right? And about to sacrifice him at the last minute, the angel Gabriel comes down and says, "Stay your hand, don't harm the boy. Instead, sacrifice this ram caught in the bushes." Because that's where that takes place, that David decides, right, when he conquers Jerusalem from the Jebusites, that it's improper, right, for the Lord to dwell in a tent. Because David is living in a nice palace, and why should he live in a palace and God live in a tent? That's something wrong about that. And he wants to build a house for the Lord. And God tells him, well, you know what, I really don't need one. I'm perfectly fine with the tent. David was very insistent. It's like, okay, fine. You want to build me a temple, a house? Okay, but not you, David. You can't do it because you are a man of war. Your son Shlomo, right, whose root word is shalem or shalom, is a man of peace. So David builds the infrastructure, and Solomon builds his temple on top of the mountain. So we can see here the temple built on top of the mountain, and in the very back room, right, was the Holy of Holies, right, the holiest place in all of Judaism, where in the first temple period, the Ark of the Covenant stood. Right, and over the Ark, right, was the Shekhinah. In Hebrew, it's called the Shekhinah, the divine presence of God, with like a sort of like a mystical cloud hovering over the Ark and also over the temple, right? And this divine essence hovering over the Ark, right, stood until the Babylonian destruction of the temple in 586 BC, right? And begins the first exile. After 50 years, the Jews are allowed to come back when Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire defeated the Babylonians and allows the Jews to return. Right? After 20 years, they are finished and they rededicate and rebuild the temple. Right? And they build a temple to serve purposes for sacrifice, but it's, it's nothing to write home about. It's not, it's not the beautiful temple that Solomon had built. They didn't have the infrastructure, the money, right? These are basically refugees who are returning home, rebuilding the city, right? And so this is the building that stood for hundreds of years until King Herod comes around. And Herod, right, not wanting to sort of make some of his, his subjects don't like him. So one possible explanation why he builds up the temple is it's going to make his Jewish subjects like him more, right? And so he was also probably thinking, why does my kingdom shouldn't have this old, 100-year-old temple building. It should be something worthy of the king of Israel or the God of Israel and worthy of my kingdom, right? So he tears down the old structure, right, and rebuilds a brand new temple. Very beautiful in design, right? But he doesn't just build up the temple itself. Right, he enlarges the whole platform surrounding the temple. This way, so more pilgrims, right, could come during the pilgrimage holidays of Passover, Pentecost, Shavuot, and Sukkot, right, Feast of Tabernacles. Right, and this is the building that stands when Jesus arrives, right, to the Mount of Olives. Now, when When the Babylonians destroyed the temple, the Shekhinah, the divine presence of God on earth, leaves. Right, according to Jewish tradition, it leaves, it heads east, right, over the Mount of Olives, and will be coming back when the Shekhinah returns. Right, he will come the same way that he left. So there's a reason that Jesus arrives on Mount of Olives. Why is this? Right, because he's now the divine essence returned. Right? He needs to come this way because this is the way the Shekhinah is supposed to return. Right? And so when Jesus comes, right, the crowds of people, right, they're enthralled to see him, very happy, right, and they put palm branches down at his feet, right, and sing Hosanna. Now, why are they singing this song? Because this song is part of the celebration of the Feast of Sukkot. Right, one of the Feasts of Tabernacles. It's a 7-day festival, and the last day, it's called Hosanna Rabbah. It's the climax of the festival. The priests, right, to the temple, they'll take myrtle branches and they will walk around the altar 7 times, and they will lay their branches at the foot of the altar. Right, then they sing the song, and at the climax of the song, we're asking God to bring the Savior, right, for the people. Right, and so here they're seeing the Savior arriving on Mount of Olives, and so what's the song that they, automatically think of? The song that they sing every year, right, during the Feast of Sukkot. Right, now he will walk down the mountain and make his way into the city. Now, in about 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, Romans come, they surround the city, besiege the city, and destroy it, right, in the year 70, and destroy the temple. Now, about 70 years later, I mentioned that there was a second revolt against the Romans, right? This is by the guy who claimed to be the Messiah. His name was Bar Kokhba, by the way. It was known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. After this revolt is crushed, the Emperor Hadrian decides to destroy Jerusalem and rebuild it as a Roman pagan city. Right? And so at the location where the Jewish temple stood, right, he wants to insult the Jews, and so he builds a pagan temple to the god of Jupiter. Now when the Romans become Christian, right, they tear down this temple along with some other pagan temples that were in the city. And they leave basically the Temple Mount into a trash dump. Right, it becomes a trash dump of the city. Now this is until the 7th century, when the Arab armies, the Muslim armies, led by the Caliph Omar, right, conquers the land and takes it away from the Byzantines in 638. Omar, who was the Caliph and the general, right, he asked to be taken to like David's holy place, and at first the archbishop takes him to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And Omar realizes that this is not the place. Like, no, take me to where the holy place of David was. And so he comes and he takes him, and it's a garbage dump. And doesn't really like what he sees. So he takes all these coins and throws it into the garbage, and he tells his men, go get the coins and clean up while you're at it. Right? And so they start cleaning. Right? And he has a Jewish convert to Islam. Akiva was his Hebrew name. I forget how it's pronounced in Akube, maybe. I forget how it's pronounced in Arabic, but his Hebrew name was Akiva. He converts and he asks him, like, where should I pray? And he tells him to pray just south of where the Dome of the Rock is today, right? Dome of the Rock obviously wasn't there, right? But south of it. And Omar says, no, I'm not going to do that, because if I do that, I'm praying, right, where you Jews pray, right? Because Jews are always facing, right, the direction of prayer is really that mountain. So I don't want to pray to the north of it. I'm going to pray to the south of it, right? Because the direction of prayer is Mecca, right? And Mecca is this way, right? So that's why the Al-Aqsa Mosque is to the south of the Dome of the Rock, because that's where Omar prays. Now, according to Islam, Jerusalem is the third holiest city in the religion, right? And there are two main reasons for this. In the 17th chapter, 17th surah of the Quran, Mohamed takes a night journey. He gets on this mythical animal with the body of a horse, the face of a woman, with wings, and flies to what's in the Quran says the Al-Aqsa Mosque. right? Which means in Arabic, the farthest mosque. It doesn't say Jerusalem. It doesn't say the word Jerusalem in the chapter. However, the context of the chapter do point to Jerusalem. Right now, he ascends heaven. He ascends from the rock, goes into heaven. Now, part of the oral tradition associated with this story in Islam is that when Muhammad ascends up into heaven, he goes through the different layers of heaven, meeting different prophets, right? Like Elijah, like Moses, like Jesus, right? And some other ones are not familiar with. He goes up and he meets God. And God says, Muhammad, how's it going? Muhammad says, it's going on. It's kind of difficult right now. Not everybody is following me, right? Mecca is kind of problematic. But I have a core group of followers and we have faith. It's like, good. I'm glad you feel like that. I have more commandments for you. Great. God, lay them on me. You and your followers, you need to pray 50 times a day. Muhammad says, thank you very much, and heads back down. On his way down, he meets Moses. Moses is one of the great prophets in Islam. And Moses says to Muhammad, hey, how was your meeting with God? Oh, it was great. He gave me a new commandment. Oh yeah, what was the new commandment? It's like, me and my followers, we got to pray 50 times a day. Moses looks at him, 50 times a day? 50 times a day, you guys are not going to be able to do anything. You're not going to eat. You're not going to, you're not going to be able to get food. Go back up and get that number down. You're not going to be able to do 50 times a day. The Jewish people, my people, we have to pray 3 times a day, and we can't even do that. You're telling me you're going to pray 50? Forget about it. Go back up and get that number down. So he goes back up and comes back down. It's like, oh, what's the new number? So it's great. Come down to 40. It's like, no, you're not listening to me. You're not going to have time to pray 40 times a day. Right? You're not going to have time to do anything else. Go back up and get that number down. So he goes back up, comes back down. So what's the new number? So it's great. Got him down to 30. It's like, Habibi, you're not listening. You're a barter, right? You're a commerce. You don't know how to argue, barter, right? Get him down to like 5, 3. I'm telling you, we Jews, we can't do it 3. There's no way you're going to try to do it at least 3. Match us. Show us what we can, if you do it, maybe we can do it. So it goes back up, comes back down, goes back up, comes back down, goes back up, comes back down. Last time Moses was like, so what's the number? So it's great. Got him down to 5. It's like, oh, you're so close, Muhammad. You're so close. Get him up. But one more time, I guarantee you can at least get 4 or 3. I'm telling you, try to match 3. Muhammad's like, no, listen, I can't argue with God anymore. Who am I to argue with God? He knows what we can do. He says we can do 5. We can do 5. I'm just sticking with 5. So he comes back down. He gets back on Al-Barak and flies back to the Arabian Peninsula. Right now, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is that you need to pray 5 times a day. Right, so this is where they got the commandment. Now, which direction do Muslims pray? Right, towards what? Mecca. Right, they face Mecca. So in the beginning, right, the first direction of prayer of Islam was actually not Mecca, it was actually Jerusalem. Right, for about 10 months, the direction of prayer for Islam was Jerusalem. There were Jewish tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, right, and like all new monotheistic religions, they want to try to get the original monotheists on board, trying to get the Jews on board, right, and so he thinks it would be easier for them, right, to join this religion if they're facing in the direction that they're already facing for prayer. Right, so for 10 months it's Jerusalem. However, Jews do not convert en masse in the Arabian Peninsula, and then it changes to Mecca, which already was a major cultic site in the pagan Arabian Peninsula. Right, and so these are the 2 reasons why Jerusalem is the holiest site, 3rd holiest site for Islam. The buildings, right, the Dome of the Rock, right, the Golden Dome, that was built in 691 by the Umayyad dynasty, right, and Al-Malik and his son Al-Walid builds the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right, the building to the left, about 20 years later. Right, the mosque, right, is the building on the left-hand side. Right, the Dome of the Rock, with the Golden Dome, that's not a mosque. It's a shrine dedicated to the story, right, of Muhammad ascending up into heaven. Now, in fact, the Dome of the Rock, interestingly, is the oldest contiguously standing building in Jerusalem. It's never been destroyed. It's never been damaged majorly, really, in an earthquake. Right, so that's the oldest building that we have today in Jerusalem. We see Mount of Olives. We have a cemetery. You can see all these graves. This is a Jewish cemetery. This is the oldest contiguous Jewish cemetery in the entire world. Right, there are graves at the foot of Mount of Olives that date to the first temple period. Right, we found Babylonian arrowheads inside the tombs. So these were people that died or saw, at the very least, the siege that Nebuchadnezzar laid on Jerusalem in 586. Jews throughout history, when they wanted to come back to the land of Israel, really a lot of them just came to sort of spend their last days and die and be buried, specifically be buried in the land of Israel, and they really want to be buried on the Mount of Olives, right? Why is this? Because the Messiah, right? The Messiah is just like Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. He's also going to arrive by way of Mount of Olives. Now, what happens when the Messiah arrives? To the dead, right? They come back to life, resurrection. The people that are buried on the Mount of Olives, they have a front row ticket to the resurrection. They're the first people to rise from the dead, right? And they're buried in a specific way, with their feet over here, their heads this way, that way. So when they rise, they get up, they see Jerusalem. They know they don't need to get their bearings. Where am I? They see Jerusalem. They just go straight down into the valley, cross the valley into the city. Now the valley has at least two names. One is called the Kidron Valley, and sort of the nickname of the valley is the Valley of Yoshvat. Yoshvat means he will judge. Why is that? Because the Messiah will stand in the middle of the valley, the dead will cross, and he will judge them whether or not they can continue into the kingdom of heaven or not. We see the stones on the graves. One of the worst curses in Judaism is Yimach Shmo. May his name be erased, right? Or may his name be forgotten, right? Because if nobody remembers you, it's one of the worst things is if nobody remembers you, it is as if you did not exist at all, right? And that's horrible. So loved ones who come and visit the deceased, they come and they put a rock on the tomb, so the soul of the person, right, knows that they are not forgotten. The little square holes are for candles to be lit inside on the memorial days or yortzites or birthdays or whatever. Now, you can see at the southern wall over here, steps that leading directly into it, and ruins, right? Archaeological ruins of buildings, right? Those are the southern steps. Those are the steps that pilgrims would have walked in, right, on their way into the temple. Now, that area, and just to the area to the left, right, you can see like the road comes around, it turns to the right, right, and then the archaeological stuff is on the right. Right, on the left is the continuation of actually the city of David, of the city of Jerusalem. Large sections of the city that were included, right, in biblical times, in the time of Jesus, right, are outside of the walls, right, because the walls of today do not necessarily go along the same route that they went 2,000 years ago, right? Large sections, specifically the southern section, right, is left out of the city. And this, by the way, is lucky, because this is why we can see the city of David today, right? Because if the city of David were inside the walls of the old city, we couldn't do the archaeological excavations that are being done there today. So it's fortuitous that this happens, right? But those are the steps that Jesus and his disciples and all the other pilgrims that come, right, would have walked upon entering into the city. So we can see the eastern wall, right, of the city. And we can actually see, if you look at the southern end of the eastern wall, you can see like these seam lines, like this division. It looks like you're using brand new building material, right? That's the seam line between the Hasmonean wall, the Maccabean wall from the 2nd century BC, right, to Herod, who extended it to the south, right? So to the left of that seam, right, that's 1st century BC, that's Herodian. To the right of it, right, the lower parts, not the top parts. The top parts like much later. It's like Ottoman period, right? The small stones. Talking about the big stones, right? Those are Hasmoneans. And now the wall, right, is actually continuing obviously this direction, and a lot of it is covered by the Muslim cemetery, right, that lies just east of the wall. We see here that gate in the middle of the eastern wall. That's what's known as the Gate of Mercy, or the Golden Gate. The Messiah is supposed to enter into that gate, which is one reason why it's blocked up. Right? During the medieval period, one of the Muslim rulers heard about the fact that the Jewish Messiah is supposed to arrive and to enter into that gate. So he does two things. He blocks it up with bricks or stones, and he allows a Muslim cemetery to be established on the eastern wall. Right? Because the Muslim governor heard about the issue of spiritual impurities, right, and dead body contamination. And the Messiah, like a priest, right, it's a really bad thing if he comes into contamination of a dead body, right? So if you allow a cemetery, right, it'll all be contaminated. The Messiah can't walk through it. It's not exactly true. He doesn't understand the small fine print of Jewish law, right? He needed a Jewish lawyer on this time, right? Because it is true, contamination is a bad thing. However, right, there's a difference between a Gentile and a Jewish contamination, right? You can be contaminated, a priest can be contaminated if he's just nearby a Jewish dead body, like 3 feet away. I don't know the exact distance, but let's say 3 feet. Right? A Gentile's body, he has to actually physically touch the body in order to become contaminated. So as long as the Messiah doesn't start digging through the graves, right, he can walk through the cemetery. He's not going to be contaminated because it's a Gentile. It's a Gentile cemetery. And a few stones aren't going to stop the Messiah, right? He's like Superman. He can leap tall buildings if he needs, right? He can easily get into the city. Now to the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, where you could, would have been a huge tower called the Antonia Fortress, right, that Herod built to garrison the Roman troops, right, and so they can have easy access to the Temple Mount in case the Jews get uppity, right, and start rioting and rebelling, right, and talking about how they don't want the Romans here anymore. Romans can just walk onto the Temple Mount, right, and kill anybody who has anything to say, right, and they would also hold like some of the priestly garments hostage inside this Antonia Fortress, because the high priest on days like Yom Kippur needs certain garments and needs certain things, right? And if he doesn't have them, he can't perform the ceremony. Can't perform the ceremony. Israel won't be forgiven for all of its sins, right? Because on Yom Kippur, the high priest, right, asks God to forgive all the sins of all of Israel, right? It's not an individual thing like it is now, right? The high priest, right, forgives all the sins of all of it, puts all the sins of the people on a scapegoat. It's literally where this term comes from, right? Puts it on a scapegoat, and he takes him to a place called, in Hebrew, it is Azazel, right? And they throw, and it's another word, sort of word for hell. If you want to say like Lech Azazel, it's like it's the equivalent of go to hell in Hebrew. They would throw this goat, right, off of the cliff, right, and its death would sort of signify. There's actually a little bit more intricate than that, but this is what they do with the scapegoat. All right, any questions? All right, so what we're going to do now, we're going to walk down the pathway over here to the Garden of Gethsemane. A few churches we're going to pass along the way. This church, the first one on the right with sort of the grayish dome, that's a Dominus Flavit, that's the Lord wept, right? That's which means the Lord wept. It is dedicated to the scene in the Bible where Jesus is weeping over the destruction of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple, right? That supposedly is where that takes place. That church is built by our favorite Italian architect Antonio Barluzzi. The church with the onion golden domes, right? That's the Russian Orthodox Church of Mary Magdalena. Interestingly enough, the Dome of the Rock, right? The golden dome of the golden dome of the building is very iconic. Most people really, when they picture Jerusalem, right, they picture that blue building with the golden dome. But for most of history, it was not gold. It was actually the color of the dome of the Aqsa Mosque, right? The sort of grayish color, not very pretty, right? But King Hussein of Jordan, right? He's the one that decided to sort of put gold plating along the dome, because when the Russian Orthodox Church put those lovely golden, the onion domes with beautiful, gold plating, King Hussein's like, well, the Russian Orthodox Church, they can't outshine, my beautiful Islamic buildings. So I'm going to put gold, right, on the building, on the dome. Right? So that's how that turned into gold. In the Russian Orthodox Church, interestingly, the Princess Alice of Greece, righteous Gentile and mother of Philip, the consort of Queen Elizabeth, she's buried. Actually, she's buried there. She was a Greek Orthodox nun. Her favorite cousin was a Russian aristocrat. Her husband was Sergei, the uncle of Tsar Nicholas. He was assassinated by radicals. And what happens a lot in Russian Orthodoxy, when like the husband dies, a lot of the women will join the Russian Orthodox Church. So she joins the Russian Orthodox Church. She is later killed by Bolsheviks. She's thrown down a well. And she will be buried there. And Princess Alice loved her cousin, and so she wanted to be buried next to her. And so that's why she's buried inside the grounds of the Russian Orthodox Church. You can't see it, but at the bottom, like where the cypress trees are, that's the Garden of Gethsemane. That's where we're going to be walking. And I heard some people talking about the other church with the red dome. That's a Greek Orthodox church, right, of St. Stephen. All right, any questions? No.
What's the trail called that we're going to walk?
Palm Sunday.